So here's the deal. We're going to be talking about space and overextension. One of the frequent viewers sent me a request to talk about this because he said he was having some questions in his game about how much is too much when it comes to grabbing space. So I thought that the best way to approach this, or maybe the most interesting and easy way for me, would be to start out with an explanation of some opening examples where overextension is pretty common, and then look at some alternatives, and then some examples where strong players manage to take a lot of space but not overextend. So the first thing is the meaning of space. I've already talked about space in some of my other videos. Maybe I'll post a link in the description for this one when it's all over. But space is basically like your territory. Usually it's marked out by your pawns. So when you have far advanced pawns, they tend to make room behind them for your other pieces to maneuver safely, because other pieces can't penetrate your pawn wall to attack those squares. So it gives you safe maneuvering room. And the pawns themselves restrict the enemy pieces from occupying key points. So this combination of giving yourself room to maneuver and occupying the key points that your opponent would like to go on to, this is what space is all about. But there is such a thing as too much. So let's see one of my games from back in the day when I was much less strong and aware than I am now, where I overextended and lost really badly. So we'll start with these two moves. So this is the Alekhine Defense, and it's probably the most provocative opening in terms of getting your opponent to take too much space and then trying to undermine their space. And this is pretty evident when you look at it, because white has two options right now. They have two options only because their pawn is hanging. It's a forcing play, so they have to deal with this threat somehow. They can either advance the pawn, or they can support the pawn. And there's a variety of moves that support the pawn, but most of them are pretty bad. Like f3 is not good. d3 is kind of unambitious. So knight c3 is what I would consider the main alternative to e5. e5 is a space grabbing move, which sounds good, but of course it entails some risk. And knight c3 is just developing a piece. So these are the main options. First, let's talk about this alternative, knight c3. This is what you would probably play if you are afraid to extend, because you're worried that once you have set up your pawn structure, that black will make some pawn breaks in order to take down your structure. I did a lesson about pawn breaks maybe a month ago. I'll definitely post that in the description. So if you guys are curious about the meaning of pawn break, which is a pawn move to free your position for the other pieces, you can check that out. Anyway, knight c3 is basically saying, I don't want that space you're offering me. I want to develop my pieces. The downside of this move is that it gives black a free hand. So there's no punishment for them playing knight f6. You might say that knight f6 is not a punishable move. Okay, in that case, it is right to play knight c3. However, since in almost every opening, black wants to play d5, and here, black can indeed simply play d5, I feel kind of like this is not a successful opening play for white. It's move 2, and black is already potentially equalizing. Here you could still play e5, but I think the circumstances are a little bit worse. One sample line that I looked at in anticipation of this lecture was knight d7. All right. By the way, welcome to Taran. I'm glad you could make it. Thanks for the hello. So knight d7 is one option that I looked at prior to this lecture, and the idea is that we're going to try to we could swap these pawns basically, and this would just be equal. Like let's say white takes, we take. Black will have no trouble developing the rest of their pieces. And this is actually kind of an important detail, because space is not useful if it doesn't create some problems for your opponent and create some helpful aspects in the position for yourself. So if you advance your pawns really far and then those pawns get traded away, it's no good. You don't have any space to restrain your opponent. And in this example, you might be able to gain a tempo and a little bit more space with a move like this, but it's really not working out because of queen d5. So we have to kind of abandon these kinds of options. There's threats, There's easy development for black. It's not working out. So trading pawns is not the most critical try. The first thing that came to my mind was d4, because this consolidates white's space. But after c5, all the same tactical options are there for black. Like if they take on d5, we could play something like pawn takes d4, and if you play queen d4, knight c6, you're definitely going to lose that e-pawn. So these are some interesting possibilities if you try to play tactically to justify your e5 advance. But if you go along more strategic lines, playing as if it were like a French defense, I think black is doing pretty well. For example, we could play these moves. And this is not the main focus for today, so I wanted to skim a little bit. I just think it's interesting to note that this position is a lot like a French defense position, except this bishop is not locked in, so they have this additional option of bishop g4. So I would even argue that not challenging the move knight f6 on move 1 could lead to a lower quality opening play for white. Black is basically getting something that looks a lot like a French position, but maybe even better. For example, this is just like a normal French. Hey Ari, welcome. And looking forward to you being up to speed. Anyway, so this was just a little bit of a tangent. The main thing that I want to address today is what happens if you play e5 in this position. And we're going to use this as just a base case to try to understand what happens when you advance your pawns really far in any position. So, e5 it is, and as you can see, the queen is attacking these spots, so the knight can't go here and immediately attack the pawn. And knight e4 is quite unwise. I didn't really plan on showing this, but I've had a lot of games against people who are kind of new to chess where I played d3 with a tempo, and then d4 with a tempo, and then d5 with a tempo, and the knight is just getting kicked all around the board, and white has tons of space, and it's not hard to support it. That's the main thing. So after like maybe knight c5, we can shore up our space with either pieces or pawns. I think either way it's just fine. We're going to develop all our pieces very nicely. So this is not the most critical test. It's knight d5 that's critical. Let's see. I think there's one more thing that I should say about space generally. So the reason that we're gaining space is so that we can support our pieces and restrict our opponent's pieces, right? I already said that a little bit. But if you think about it specifically, like we want a pawn structure that supports our pieces. This is a sort of important metaphor to try to understand space better. Because if we have a certain pawn structure, for example, like the French pawn structure that we were looking at, I'll just pop back to that for a second. If we're looking at a pawn structure that we've made, we're going to ask ourselves, are there good places for my pieces in this pawn structure? And if we ask for white, we might say that the answer is yes. We can keep one knight here on d4. This other knight, it'll either get traded or it'll stay on f3, which is not amazing. You could watch my video about piece activity if you want to understand why I say that. But we can see this bishop's going to go here. White has no trouble castling. They can move their queen to d2 and play c3. So everything looks good for white, but it also looks good for black because they can swap one pair of knights. Generally that alleviates any space problem that you have. And then put the other knight right here. Here, I'll just make these yellow so you can easily tell. They'll put the other knight here. Move this bishop to e7, probably. Castle. And again, they also have no trouble utilizing all of their pieces. So if white and black both don't have any trouble developing all their pieces, then no one is space challenged. The nature of the conflict will be different.